The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 set the stage for a new kind of naval conflict in the Atlantic and beyond. Unlike the First World War, which had been dominated by German U-boats, the Kriegsmarine under Admiral Erich Raeder intended to complement submarine warfare with surface raiding operations. The concept of the Commerce Raider was not new. The High Seas Fleet had experimented with it during 1914-18, and interwar planning emphasized that Germany, with its relatively small fleet compared to Britain, could not directly challenge the Royal Navy's numerical superiority. Instead, it would aim to disrupt Britain's lifeline of maritime trade, stretching across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Pacific. The Admiral Scheer, a Deutschland-class heavy cruiser officially designated as a pocket battleship, represented one of the Kriegsmarine's solutions to this imbalance. Launched in 1933, she displaced just over 12,000 tons standard, but carried 6 280mm guns in 2 triple turrets, giving her a striking power disproportionate to her size. With a range exceeding 1,000 nautical miles at cruising speed, she was designed for long, independent missions. Her relatively light armor reflected the German concept of avoiding decisive fleet battles while exploiting endurance and speed. By late 1939 and early 1940, Germany's naval war had already demonstrated the value and risks of such surface raiders. The Admiral Graf Spee's cruise in the South Atlantic had achieved notable successes before ending with the ship scuttling off Montevideo in December 1939. This episode reinforced both the potential of surface raiders and the difficulty of sustaining them once cornered by superior British forces. Britain, dependent on maritime imports for food, fuel, and war material, understood the danger posed by even a handful of raiders. Convoys were hastily organized, and hunting groups of cruisers and carriers dispatched to track German vessels. Against this backdrop, Operation Nordseetour, the cruise of the Admiral Scheer, was conceived. In 1940, Germany had successfully invaded Norway, extending the Kriegsmarine's operational reach into the North Atlantic. Bases at Trondheim and Narvik provided staging grounds, though losses in destroyers and cruisers during the campaign had weakened the surface fleet. For Raeder, sending Admiral Scheer on a long-range commerce raiding mission in late 1940 was both a strategic necessity and a calculated gamble. The broader geopolitical context was equally decisive. By autumn 1940, the Battle of Britain had concluded without a German invasion of the United Kingdom, making economic warfare at sea even more critical. The United States, though not yet at war, had extended its neutrality patrols deep into the Atlantic, tightening cooperation with Britain. Italy, Germany's Axis partner, was fighting in the Mediterranean but lacked the ability to challenge British supremacy at sea. Thus, German hopes of forcing Britain into submission rested largely on strangling its trade routes. Within Germany, public sentiment toward the Kriegsmarine was mixed. The scuttling of the Graf Spee had been framed as a heroic self-sacrifice, but many wondered if surface raiders could truly alter the course of the war. Propaganda emphasized the prestige of ships like Admiral Scheer, portraying them as instruments capable of breaking Britain's will. In the officer corps, debates raged between proponents of U-boat warfare, led by Admiral Karl Dönitz, and raiders advocates of a balanced fleet strategy that still included capital ships. Intelligence assessments shaped planning as well. The Kriegsmarine believed that Allied convoy escort strength remained insufficient, particularly in the mid-Atlantic air gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach. At the same time, British code-breaking at Bletchley Park was increasingly effective, though its impact on Admiral Scheer's specific mission remains debated. German planners assumed that with careful movement and deception, a raider could slip into the Atlantic and disrupt convoys before the Royal Navy could concentrate forces against her. Thus, the stage was set for Operation Nordseetour. Admiral Scheer, under the command of Kapitän zur See Theodor Kranke, prepared for a mission that would take her across vast oceans, through hostile patrol lines, and into the heart of Britain's maritime lifelines. The cruise would test not only the endurance of a single ship, but the viability of Germany's entire surface raiding strategy. It represented a clash of doctrines, one side relying on mobility, surprise, and commerce disruption, the other on global naval supremacy, convoy organization, and the ability to concentrate overwhelming force. In November 1940, as Admiral Scheer prepared to leave port, neither side could predict how the cruise would unfold. For Germany, success might demonstrate that even a numerically inferior navy could alter the balance of a global war. For Britain, failure to contain such a raider would expose vulnerabilities that threatened its very survival. The journey that followed would span the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and even into the Indian Ocean, making the Admiral Scheer's mission one of the most remarkable commerce-raiding cruises of the Second World War. The departure of Admiral Scheer from German-controlled waters marked the beginning of one of the most daring surface raider operations of the Second World War. On 23 October 1940, the ship slipped out of Gotenhafen, today's Gdynia, under the cover of night. Her commander, Kapitan Zerzay Theodor Kranke, faced a formidable task: to evade the dense network of British patrols in the North Sea and reach the open Atlantic undetected. The decision to launch her at this time reflected both opportunity and risk. Germany's surface fleet had been diminished by earlier losses, but a single raider, properly handled, could disrupt trade on a scale disproportionate to its size. The opening phase of the mission depended on deception and stealth. Admiral Scheer, outwardly resembling a heavy cruiser, carried sufficient speed to outpace many escorts, but was vulnerable if trapped by a full British battle group. The North Sea and the waters around Norway were heavily monitored by British submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and naval patrols. To reduce the chance of detection, Kranke chose to take advantage of poor weather, using storms as cover to pass through the Denmark Strait. Despite British intelligence efforts, which included monitoring German ports and aerial reconnaissance, Admiral Scheer's departure went unnoticed. By early November 1940, the ship had successfully reached the North Atlantic. Her escape underscored the challenges Britain faced in maintaining effective surveillance over such vast waters. Although the Royal Navy deployed more than a dozen cruiser squadrons and carrier groups across the Atlantic, the ocean's sheer size left inevitable gaps. These gaps became hunting grounds for German raiders, whose mission was not to seek battle, but to intercept convoys, sink merchantmen, and force the Allies to disperse resources in pursuit. The first major action of the cruise came swiftly. On 5 November, west of Ireland, Admiral Scheer intercepted convoy HX-84, a formation of 38 merchant ships sailing from Halifax to Britain. Escorting the convoy was only one warship, the armed merchant cruiser HMS Jervis Bay, commanded by Captain Edward Fegan. Jervis Bay, armed with 8 outdated 152mm guns, stood little chance against the 280mm heavy batteries of the German pocket battleship. Nonetheless, the British vessel placed herself between the convoy and Admiral Scheer, engaging in a hopeless defense. The battle was short and decisive. Within less than half an hour, Jervis Bay was ablaze and sinking, her captain killed at his post. Admiral Scheer then turned on the convoy itself, sinking or capturing 6 merchant vessels before nightfall. Yet the bravery of Jervis Bay had achieved its purpose. The convoy dispersed, and most of its ships escaped under cover of darkness. British losses in men and tonnage were significant, but the action became widely publicized as an example of sacrifice in defense of vital supply lines. For Kranke, the encounter was both a tactical success and a strategic warning. The Royal Navy would now intensify its hunt for his ship, knowing that a German surface raider was loose in the Atlantic. Following HX-84, Admiral Scheer moved swiftly southward. Kranke avoided lingering in one area for too long, knowing that British hunting groups composed of cruisers and carriers would converge on his last known position. The German naval staff coordinated with supply ships pre-positioned in the Atlantic to provide fuel, ammunition, and provisions. This logistical system was essential. Without it, raiders like Admiral Scheer could not sustain long operations. For the men aboard, these supply rendezvous offered brief respite from the monotony and tension of constant readiness, though they carried their own dangers if discovered by Allied patrols. On the British side, the reaction was immediate. Convoy procedures were tightened, and additional escorts were assigned where possible. Hunting groups, including aircraft carriers such as HMS Furious and Ark Royal, were diverted to track the raider. Yet, even with superior resources, the difficulty of locating a single ship in the vastness of the ocean was apparent. Admiral Scheer's survival after the attack on HX-84 reinforced the perception that Germany's commerce raiders remained a potent threat, capable of striking unexpectedly and vanishing into the open sea. For the sailors aboard Admiral Scheer, the early weeks of the cruise demonstrated both the possibilities and dangers of their mission. They had seen the effectiveness of their ship's heavy guns against poorly armed escorts, but they also knew that a single encounter with a British battleship would likely prove fatal. Life on board was a mixture of routine drills, watch duties, and sudden moments of intense combat. Discipline and training remained strict, for survival depended on seamless coordination of gunnery, navigation, and engineering crews. Thus, the opening phase of Operation Nordseetour set the tone for the months that followed. Admiral Scheer had broken into the Atlantic, struck a convoy, and evaded pursuit. The Royal Navy now faced the challenge of protecting merchant traffic while spreading its forces across a global theater. For Germany, the successful beginning of the cruise demonstrated the viability of surface raiding, at least for the moment. The next stages would carry the ship far from European waters, into the South Atlantic and beyond, where the struggle between commerce raiding and convoy defense would continue on an even larger scale. The strategic objectives behind Operation Nordseetour reflected the complex balance between ambition and limitation within the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet strategy. Admiral Scheer was not intended to seek fleet engagements, but to serve as a disruptive element within the broader German naval war effort. In essence, her mission was to force the Royal Navy to disperse its superior strength, to harass shipping lanes, and to exploit Britain's dependence on maritime imports. This approach mirrored Germany's broader wartime economic warfare strategy, which combined U-boat campaigns with surface raiding in an effort to cut Britain off from vital resources. From the German perspective, the operational goals of Admiral Scheer's voyage were threefold. First, she was to inflict direct losses on merchant shipping, both by sinking vessels and by capturing them as prizes. The capture of intact merchantmen could provide valuable cargoes of food, raw materials, or fuel. Second, she was to tie down Allied naval forces disproportionate to her own size. Even a single commerce raider forced the Royal Navy to deploy multiple hunting groups, each including heavy cruisers, destroyers, and often carriers, just to cover the possibility of her presence. Third, Admiral Scheer's movements were to demonstrate Germany's naval reach, projecting influence into distant seas and unsettling the Allies' confidence in their control of trade routes. Logistical planning was central to these objectives. The Kriegsmarine lacked overseas bases after 1919, meaning that raiders like Admiral Scheer could not rely on friendly ports for resupply. Instead, Germany developed a network of supply ships, tanker auxiliaries, and refrigerated freighters that rendezvoused with raiders at prearranged coordinates in remote parts of the ocean. These ships carried fuel, provisions, ammunition, and even spare parts for repairs. The system demanded precise navigation and secrecy, for discovery by Allied reconnaissance could spell disaster. For Admiral Scheer, this logistical backbone enabled her to extend her cruise far beyond the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean, an operational reach few German warships had achieved in the previous conflict. Doctrinally, Admiral Scheer's mission reflected the interwar debates within the German Navy. Admiral Raeder had long argued for a balanced fleet capable of challenging Britain at sea, though this ambition was undermined by Germany's limited industrial capacity and the constraints of rearmament. Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, argued instead for prioritizing submarines as the decisive weapon against Britain's commerce. In this debate, Operation Nordseetour was something of a test case. Could a surface raider achieve results comparable to a wolf pack, or would it prove an expensive distraction? On the British side, strategic planning was equally nuanced. The Royal Navy recognized that Germany's surface raiders, though few in number, had outsized disruptive potential. The earlier experience with Admiral Graf Spee in 1939 had shown how even a single ship could generate anxiety across multiple oceans. Consequently, Britain relied heavily on convoy systems, grouping merchantmen together under naval escort. Yet, convoy organization required enormous resources. Escorts were in short supply in 1940-41, with only a limited number of destroyers and corvettes available to cover routes from North America, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. The Admiralty faced a dilemma: concentrate escorts to defend vital convoys, or spread them thinly to provide broader but weaker coverage. Intelligence was another decisive element in Allied planning. By late 1940, Bletchley Park's cryptanalysis of German Enigma traffic was making progress, though it was not yet consistently reliable. Radio intelligence and long-range reconnaissance from RAF Coastal Command played crucial roles in tracking raiders. However, gaps remained, especially in the Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic. For Britain, countering Admiral Scheer required both technological solutions and the deployment of mobile hunting groups, often built around an aircraft carrier with cruiser support. Propaganda also framed the strategic struggle. German radio broadcasts celebrated the commerce raiders as symbols of naval resurgence, heirs to the tradition of Admiral von Spee's squadron in 1914. The British government, while downplaying the immediate losses, highlighted the resilience of the convoy system and the sacrifices of escort crews, such as those of HMS Jervis Bay. Each side sought to control public perception, aware that morale on the home front was as vital as tonnage sunk or saved. At the operational level, the planning for Admiral Scheer's mission also accounted for flexibility. Kranke was given wide latitude to decide where and when to strike. German Naval Command provided intelligence updates and suggested hunting grounds, but recognized that the success of such cruises depended on initiative. The commander had to balance aggression with caution, striking where merchant shipping was vulnerable, but avoiding engagements with superior naval forces. The long-term survival of the ship was itself a strategic victory, for every month she remained at large forced the Royal Navy to divert resources away from other theaters. In evaluating these preparations, one must recognize the contrast in scale. Admiral Scheer displaced barely a tenth of the Royal Navy's capital ships combined, yet her mission threatened to disrupt supply lines, sustaining millions of British civilians and troops deployed overseas. For Germany, success in such operations offered the possibility of prolonging the war by economic strangulation. For Britain, preventing even partial disruption of maritime imports was essential to survival. Thus, the cruise of a single pocket battleship carried implications far beyond her displacement or firepower, becoming a test of endurance, logistics, and doctrine for both sides. As Admiral Scheer steamed deeper into the Atlantic after her opening engagements, the strategic goals of her voyage came into clearer focus. She was not simply a ship at sea, but a manifestation of the broader contest between a continental power attempting to break out and a maritime empire fighting to secure its lifelines. The next encounters would reveal how these strategies fared when confronted with the realities of combat, weather, and the relentless scale of global war. The first direct confrontations of Admiral Scheer's crews illustrated both the effectiveness of German commerce raiding and the challenges inherent in sustaining such operations across vast oceans. The engagement with convoy HX-84 in November 1940 had demonstrated her offensive capability. 6 merchant ships destroyed or captured, and the armed merchant cruiser HMS Jervis Bay sunk. Yet this action also alerted the Royal Navy to her presence, triggering an intensive hunt across the Atlantic. For Captain Zersier Theodor Kranke, the priority became maintaining unpredictability, striking where escorts were weak, and disappearing before counterforces could close in. After HX-84, Admiral Scheer steamed southward toward the central Atlantic. British intelligence reports placed her in multiple locations, some accurate, others misinterpreted. The Admiralty dispatched hunting groups composed of cruisers and carriers, including HMS Renown and HMS Ark Royal, but these formations struggled to cover the expanse of ocean. By the time convoys were rerouted and forces concentrated, Scheer had already changed course. For the German crew, this phase was defined by tense vigilance. The possibility of encountering a superior force, such as a battle cruiser or fleet carrier, was constant, and the need for strict radio silence imposed psychological strain. In mid-November, Admiral Scheer encountered the refrigerated freighter Port Hobart, bound for Britain with a cargo of frozen meat. Rather than sinking her immediately, Kranke chose to use the vessel as a supply ship, transferring prisoners from earlier sinkings and offloading captured cargo. This practice highlighted the dual purpose of commerce raiding. Immediate destruction of shipping was important, but captured vessels could provide valuable logistical support, extending the raiders' endurance. The fate of Port Hobart, eventually sent to a German-controlled port, also revealed the dilemmas faced by merchant crews, whether to resist capture, risking annihilation, or submit in hopes of survival. In December 1940, Admiral Scheer entered the South Atlantic. Here, shipping routes from South America to Britain offered new opportunities. On 18th of December, she intercepted the British freighter Duquesa, carrying a large cargo of frozen meat and fruit. Instead of sinking the vessel, Kranke again used it as a prize ship. This decision reflected the German emphasis on selective attacks, aiming to maximize disruption, without unnecessarily consuming ammunition or fuel. The Duquesa, manned by a German prize crew, eventually rendezvoused with supply vessels, serving as a floating warehouse. The most dramatic confrontation of this phase occurred later in December, when Admiral Scheer approached the convoy known as SL Lasfin B, bound from Sierra Leone to Britain. The convoy was lightly escorted, and the opportunity for destruction appeared significant. However, poor weather and evasive maneuvers allowed the bulk of the convoy to escape, with Scheer sinking only a handful of ships. This episode underscored the difficulties raiders faced when confronting organized convoys. Even minimal escort forces could delay or divert attacks long enough for most merchantmen to scatter. For British seamen, these encounters carried immediate human costs. Merchant crews faced sudden bombardment or the prospect of capture, often with little warning. Survivors spent weeks as prisoners aboard the raider or in auxiliary vessels before eventual transfer to Germany. Reports from repatriated sailors later described conditions aboard Admiral Scheer as relatively disciplined, though cramped and uncertain. For German sailors, handling hundreds of prisoners presented logistical challenges, requiring strict organization to prevent unrest while maintaining operational efficiency. On the political level, each engagement resonated far beyond the number of ships sunk. The Admiralty issued communiques stressing the continued safety of the majority of convoys, while German propaganda emphasized every success as proof of Britain's vulnerability. The loss of HMS Jervis Bay, in particular, was heavily publicized by both sides. In Britain, as a symbol of sacrifice; in Germany, as evidence of the futility of convoy escorts against a modern warship. Yet the naval balance remained heavily weighted in Britain's favor. For every convoy attacked by Admiral Scheer, dozens more crossed the Atlantic unharmed. German planners recognized this, but they also understood that the mere presence of a raider tied down disproportionate Allied resources. In this sense, every day Admiral Scheer remained at large was a form of victory. The Royal Navy's efforts to locate her diverted cruisers and carriers from other duties, stretching an already overburdened escort system. Civilian morale reflected these dynamics. In Britain, news of losses generated anxiety, but also determination to continue with the convoy system. In Germany, reports of Scheer's successes contributed to a narrative of naval prowess, offsetting earlier disappointments such as the scuttling of Admiral Graf Spee. For neutral nations, particularly in South America, the raiders' presence raised concerns about the security of trade routes and the potential escalation of naval operations near their waters. By early 1941, Admiral Scheer had established a reputation as one of the most successful German surface raiders. Within weeks, she had sunk or captured a dozen merchant vessels, totaling more than 1,000 tons of shipping. Her ability to strike in multiple areas, from the North Atlantic to the South Atlantic, created uncertainty that far exceeded the damage inflicted. Yet these early confrontations also revealed the limitations of surface raiding, dependence on luck, vulnerability to superior forces, and reliance on an increasingly complex logistical network. The first phase of combat engagements, therefore, highlighted the dual nature of Operation Nordseetour. On one hand, Admiral Scheer demonstrated the potency of a single modern warship operating independently against merchant traffic. On the other, she exposed the inherent weaknesses of Germany's surface fleet strategy, which could not decisively alter the balance of naval power. The next stage of her cruise would test whether she could extend her reach even further, into waters where British escort strength was thinner, but where logistical challenges loomed larger. By early 1941, Admiral Scheer's raiding cruise entered its next more complex stage. The South Atlantic had offered lucrative hunting grounds, but it also brought greater risks of detection. British and Allied hunting groups had been dispatched in response to each reported sighting, and the Admiralty was determined not to allow another prolonged disruption like that caused by Admiral Graf Spee in 1939. For Kapitän zur See Theodor Kranke, maintaining the initiative required constant movement, careful planning, and reliance on Germany's extended supply network. This phase of the operation, marked by both escalation and crisis, revealed the fragility of Germany's commerce raiding strategy. One of the defining features of this stage was the increasing importance of auxiliary vessels. The Kriegsmarine had pre-positioned supply ships, disguised as neutral freighters, across the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean. These auxiliaries provided not only fuel and provisions, but also medical care, spare parts, and even space for prisoners. For Admiral Scheer, rendezvous with such vessels allowed her to remain at sea for months without returning to port. Yet each rendezvous carried danger. If discovered by British reconnaissance, the raider and her supply ship could both be destroyed. The sinking of the German supply ship Altmark by HMS Cossack in February 1940 remained a vivid reminder of the vulnerability of this system. Operational challenges mounted as Admiral Scheer ranged farther from Europe. In January 1941, Kranke steered his ship into the South Atlantic approaches near Brazil, seeking to intercept traffic bound for Britain from South America. There, Scheer captured and sank several merchantmen, adding to her tally of destroyed shipping. However, each attack increased the risk of interception, as radio distress signals alerted the Admiralty to her general area. British forces scrambled to respond, but again the sheer vastness of the ocean allowed Scheer to evade capture. The tension on board, however, remained constant. Every smoke plume on the horizon had to be evaluated. Every contact checked against the possibility of encountering a superior British warship. Weather and geography imposed further difficulties. Tropical storms hampered visibility, while the equatorial heat placed additional strain on machinery and crew. Maintaining operational efficiency during long deployments demanded rigorous discipline. Engine room personnel worked in extreme conditions to ensure that the ship's turbines remained functional, while gunnery crews conducted frequent drills to maintain readiness. The morale of the crew, bolstered by earlier successes, was tested by the monotony of long stretches without action and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The crisis element emerged not only from external threats but also from internal constraints. Ammunition stocks, though sufficient for isolated engagements, could not support prolonged battles. Fuel consumption remained a constant concern, particularly as the ship prepared to extend operations into the Indian Ocean. Each decision to attack a convoy or merchantman had to be weighed against the need to conserve resources for the longer strategic aim of disrupting global trade routes. Kranke's caution reflected this awareness. Avoiding unnecessary engagements with heavily escorted convoys became a priority. On the Allied side, the campaign against Admiral Scheer intensified. The Royal Navy's doctrine emphasized concentration of force, but the demands of global war stretched resources thin. Convoys from South America, Africa, and India now required heavier escort, pulling ships from other critical theaters. The introduction of long-range aircraft from West Africa and Gibraltar extended Allied reconnaissance, though the air gap in the mid-Atlantic remained a weakness. Intelligence services pieced together reports from survivors, wireless intercepts, and neutral observers, but Admiral Scheer's movements often outpaced the Admiralty's ability to respond. Political implications also deepened the crisis. Neutral nations, particularly in South America, watched developments closely. The interception of shipping bound for or from their ports risked diplomatic incidents, especially if neutral crews were caught in the crossfire. The United States, though not yet at war, followed these operations with concern. Admiral Scheer's activities highlighted the vulnerability of transatlantic trade routes, reinforcing the U.S. Navy's decision to expand its neutrality patrols. While Germany sought to avoid direct provocation of the United States, every attack in the Western Atlantic brought the possibility of diplomatic fallout. By February 1941, Admiral Scheer had achieved significant results. She had sunk or captured over a dozen vessels, accounting for more than 1,000 tons of shipping. Yet the escalation of Allied countermeasures revealed the precariousness of her mission. Every success increased her visibility, tightening the noose of naval patrols and reconnaissance. The German naval staff celebrated her achievements in propaganda, but within the officer corps, there were already debates about whether such cruises could deliver decisive results compared to the growing U-boat campaign. The challenges faced by Admiral Scheer in this period illustrate the paradox of surface raiding. A single ship could inflict disproportionate disruption, forcing the diversion of Allied resources. Yet that same ship remained isolated, vulnerable to detection, and dependent on a fragile supply chain. The crisis of this stage was not defined by a single battle, but by the cumulative weight of risks, mechanical strain, logistical vulnerability, and the constant threat of superior enemy forces. As Admiral Scheer prepared to leave the South Atlantic and push into the Indian Ocean, these pressures only intensified. For Germany, the question remained whether commerce raiding could achieve the strategic results necessary to weaken Britain. For Britain, the challenge was how to balance limited resources between multiple theaters while maintaining the integrity of global supply lines. In the months to come, both sides would be forced to adapt as the raider extended her cruise into new waters, testing the limits of endurance and the resilience of maritime warfare. By March 1941, Admiral Scheer had reached the peak of her long cruise, expanding operations beyond the South Atlantic into the waters of the Indian Ocean. This stage represented both the high point of her success as a commerce raider and the moment of greatest risk as she ventured farther from European support networks. The move eastward was not merely opportunistic, but part of a calculated decision by Kapitän zur See Theodor Kranke and the German naval staff to widen the theater of disruption, striking at shipping routes where British escort strength was thinner and where the presence of a surface raider was least expected. The transition to the Indian Ocean required careful logistical preparation. Admiral Scheer rendezvoused with German supply ships that had been deployed months in advance, carrying fuel, ammunition, provisions, and replacement parts. At sea, these replenishment operations were conducted with precision, often under conditions of secrecy and haste. Hundreds of tons of fuel oil were transferred across hoses stretched between the raider and the supply ship, while cranes and boats ferried crates of food, shells, and spare machinery. These moments provided temporary relief for the crew, but they also carried grave danger. Any Allied reconnaissance aircraft or warship stumbling upon the scene could end the mission abruptly. In April 1941, Admiral Scheer entered the Western Indian Ocean. The shift caught the British off guard. Most Allied naval forces in the region were concentrated in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, covering convoys supplying Egypt and the Middle East. The Indian Ocean trade routes linking Africa, India, and Australia to Britain had lighter escorts, reflecting the Royal Navy's focus on the Atlantic and Mediterranean. For several weeks, Scheer enjoyed relative freedom of movement, targeting vulnerable shipping lanes off East Africa and around Madagascar. One of the most significant actions of this phase was the interception of the British freighter Canadian cruiser, carrying general cargo from India. After a brief gun action, the merchantman was captured, her crew taken aboard as prisoners. This encounter illustrated the continuing effectiveness of surprise. Merchant ships without escorts could do little more than send distress signals before succumbing to the raiders' heavy guns. Another success came with the sinking of the Greek vessel Prometheus, highlighting how even neutral or Allied-aligned ships outside the North Atlantic remained exposed to Germany's extended raiding operations. Yet the very extension of Admiral Scheer's operations highlighted the strategic difficulties of surface raiding. The farther she sailed from the Atlantic, the more tenuous her supply lines became. German auxiliaries operating in the Indian Ocean faced their own dangers, hunted by British cruisers and aircraft. The logistical web that sustained Scheer depended on precise timing and secrecy, but each success risked exposure through survivor reports or radio transmissions. British intelligence, though not always precise, pieced together fragments of information that suggested a German raider was active in the region. In response, convoys were rerouted and additional escorts deployed from South Africa and India. The burden on the crew also intensified during this period. Long deployments tested endurance, with men spending months at sea in confined conditions. The tropical heat of the Indian Ocean compounded the strain, especially in engine rooms where temperatures soared. Officers worked tirelessly to maintain discipline and morale, rotating duties to prevent exhaustion. Prisoners of war captured from merchantmen were housed in makeshift quarters, requiring guards and additional rations, further stretching the ship's resources. Despite these challenges, the crew's cohesion remained intact, sustained by the knowledge that they were achieving results far beyond what might be expected of a single vessel. From a strategic standpoint, Admiral Scheer's Indian Ocean foray represented the maximum reach of German surface raiding during the Second World War. Few other capital ships ventured so far from Europe. For Britain and her allies, the presence of a German raider in these waters underscored the global dimensions of the conflict. Shipping routes that had once seemed secure now appeared vulnerable, and resources had to be diverted to counter a threat far from the main theaters of war. The propaganda value of these operations was not overlooked. German broadcasts trumpeted each sinking as proof that the Reich's Navy could strike anywhere, projecting an image of global power. British announcements, by contrast, emphasized the relatively small scale of losses compared to the vast volume of shipping that continued to flow through the Indian Ocean. Both sides understood that the psychological impact of raiders often exceeded their material achievements. For Britain, maintaining public confidence in the convoy system was paramount. For Germany, demonstrating reach and initiative was essential to morale at home. At the peak of her campaign, Admiral Scheer had inflicted losses of over 1,000 tons of shipping, an impressive figure for a single ship. Her presence had forced the Royal Navy to divert cruisers, carriers, and destroyers to multiple theaters, complicating British operations in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Yet the inherent risks of her mission remained unresolved. A single encounter with a superior British force could end the cruise, and each passing month increased the probability of detection. Thus, by mid-1941, Admiral Scheer stood at a crossroads. She had demonstrated the reach and impact of surface raiding on a global scale, yet the strain of distance, logistics, and Allied countermeasures foreshadowed the limits of such operations. The Indian Ocean successes marked the high point of Operation Nordseetour, but they also raised questions about sustainability. For Germany, the challenge was not whether a raider could achieve results, but whether such results justified the risks and resources expended. For Britain, the lesson was clear. The defense of maritime trade required vigilance not only in the Atlantic, but across the world's oceans. The next stages of the voyage would reveal whether Admiral Scheer could continue her remarkable cruise, or whether the increasing weight of Allied counteraction would close the net. The ship had reached the peak of her effectiveness, but every peak is followed by a descent, and the limits of Germany's surface fleet strategy were beginning to come into view. By the summer of 1941, Admiral Scheer had already covered tens of thousands of nautical miles and struck in regions few German warships had ever reached. Yet, as the cruise lengthened, both the raider and her crew were compelled to adapt constantly to changing conditions. Resistance from the Allies grew more organized, convoys became more heavily escorted, and the Kriegsmarine's logistical network came under increasing strain. This period showcased how both sides adjusted their strategies, highlighting the improvisations, countermeasures, and psychological burdens that defined the middle stage of Operation Nordseetour. One of the most important shifts was the Allies' adoption of convoy reinforcement and dispersal tactics. Convoys in the Indian Ocean, once lightly escorted, began to receive additional protection from cruisers deployed from South Africa and India. Where such protection was absent, merchant captains were instructed to disperse at the first sign of a raider, forcing Admiral Scheer to choose between pursuing scattered targets or breaking off to avoid wasting ammunition and fuel. This adaptation reflected Britain's growing ability to prioritize resources, even while engaged in heavy operations in the Mediterranean and the Battle of the Atlantic. For Admiral Scheer, the challenge lay in finding new ways to exploit weaknesses. Kranke continued to use deception, employing false flag tactics when approaching targets, a common practice among commerce raiders. Flying neutral or Allied colors until the last moment allowed him to close the distance before revealing the ship's identity. However, this method also grew more dangerous as merchantmen increasingly carried wireless sets capable of transmitting distress signals instantly. The result was a constant race against time to disable the enemy before a distress call brought Allied hunters into the area. The logistical network supporting Admiral Scheer also adapted. German auxiliary ships, including tankers and supply vessels disguised as neutral freighters, expanded their range into the Indian Ocean and South Atlantic. These ships not only replenished the raider, but also took aboard captured crews, relieving Scheer of the burden of hundreds of prisoners. Improvisation was key. Some auxiliaries were converted into makeshift prison ships. Others carried workshops for repairs, ensuring that even far from Europe, the raider could sustain her operations. Still, the risk of discovery was ever present. Several German supply ships were intercepted and sunk during 1941. Demonstrating the vulnerability of this support system once the Allies concentrated their efforts. Resistance was not only institutional, but personal. Merchant crews developed improvised strategies to resist capture, such as steering erratic courses, using smoke screens, or even attempting to ram the attacker. While these efforts rarely succeeded against a warship with heavy guns, they reflected the growing determination of Allied sailors not to yield easily. Stories of resistance circulated widely, reinforcing morale within the merchant navy, and emphasizing that even against overwhelming firepower, defiance could buy time for others to escape. Partisan-style adaptation also emerged in the Allied use of intelligence networks. Reports from neutral ports, aerial reconnaissance flights, and radio intercepts combined to build a picture of Admiral Scheer's movements. Though often incomplete or outdated, this intelligence guided the deployment of hunting groups. By mid-1941, British and Commonwealth cruisers had begun to operate more aggressively in likely raider zones, reducing the freedom Admiral Scheer had once enjoyed. The ship was forced into more evasive routing, sometimes sailing vast detours to avoid areas of concentrated Allied presence. Psychologically, the long cruise placed increasing strain on both sides. For the crew of Admiral Scheer, the initial thrill of success gave way to fatigue. Months at sea, constant alerts, and the responsibility of operating independently created a sense of isolation. Officers had to manage not only the technical efficiency of the ship, but also the morale of over 1,000 men, ensuring discipline under monotonous and stressful conditions. On the Allied side, the persistence of raiders reinforced anxieties among merchant sailors. Each new voyage carried the possibility of sudden attack, and even when no raider appeared, the fear of one-shape behavior at sea. Innovation became essential to sustaining the German effort. Admiral Scheer's crew developed new routines for fuel conservation, adjusting cruising speeds to maximize range. Gunnery officers refined procedures for engaging lightly armed merchantmen efficiently, often using secondary armament to save heavy shells. Prisoner management was also systematized. Captured sailors were processed quickly, their ships either sunk or converted into prize vessels. These adaptations allowed Scheer to maintain her effectiveness deep into the cruise, but they also underscored the limits of improvisation when confronted with overwhelming Allied resources. The Allies likewise innovated. Long-range patrol aircraft operating from Freetown, Durban, and Aden began to cover wider areas, extending reconnaissance into previously unmonitored waters. Radio intelligence steadily improved, narrowing the window of opportunity for raiders to operate undetected. By late 1941, convoy escorts included not only traditional destroyers and cruisers, but also converted merchant carriers, escort carriers, capable of deploying aircraft to spot and attack raiders. This shift represented a decisive adaptation, gradually closing the freedom of maneuver that had once been the raiders' advantage. Thus, the middle phase of Admiral Scheer's cruise highlighted the dynamic interplay of resistance and adaptation. Each success prompted a countermeasure, and each countermeasure required new improvisation. For Germany, the question was how long a single ship could remain effective against a global maritime system adjusting to her presence. For Britain and its allies, the challenge lay in scaling up these adaptations quickly enough to protect vital trade without weakening other theaters of war. By late 1941, the cumulative effects of Allied adaptation were beginning to tell. Though Admiral Scheer remained at large, the opportunities for easy interception of unescorted merchantmen diminished. The raiders' movements became increasingly constrained, her reliance on supply ships more hazardous, and her prospects of achieving decisive disruption less certain. Yet the psychological and strategic impact of her continued survival remained undeniable, compelling both sides to refine their approaches as the balance of maritime warfare shifted. By the final months of 1941, Admiral Scheer's voyage approached its decisive turning point. What had begun as an audacious breakout into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans now evolved into a prolonged test of endurance. Both German planners and British counterforces recognized that the balance of momentum was shifting. For Germany, the question became whether continued raiding could still deliver meaningful disruption. For Britain, the priority was closing the net on one of the last major surface raiders still at large. The turning point was not marked by a single battle, but by a series of converging developments: logistical strain, intensified Allied counteraction, and the growing dominance of submarines over surface raiders. By autumn 1941, the Royal Navy had begun to tighten its grip. Increased use of long-range aircraft from Ascension Island, Freetown, and Aden expanded Allied surveillance capacity, reducing the blind zones in which raiders once operated with impunity. The introduction of escort carriers further altered the tactical environment. These converted merchant hulls carried only a few aircraft, but even a handful of reconnaissance planes could spot a surface raider before it reached a convoy. For Admiral Scheer, this meant that approaching large groups of merchantmen became increasingly hazardous. Surprise, which had been central to her earlier successes, was now harder to achieve. German command understood this changing environment. Within the Kriegsmarine, debate intensified over the value of committing large surface ships to distant raiding missions. Admiral Raeder continued to support balanced fleet operations, emphasizing that ships like Scheer forced the Allies to spread their forces. Grand Admiral Dönitz, by contrast, argued that U-boats offered a far more efficient method of strangling Britain's supply lines. The contrasting doctrines placed raider operations under growing scrutiny. Scheer's success, over 1,000 tons of shipping destroyed, was significant but modest when compared with the tonnage losses inflicted by submarine wolf packs in the Atlantic. The turning point also appeared in logistics. Several German supply ships that supported raiders were intercepted and sunk by the Royal Navy in late 1941. Without these auxiliaries, extended operations became increasingly difficult. Kranke faced the reality that each rendezvous with a tanker or supply ship carried immense risk. A single successful interception could strand his ship far from friendly ports, vulnerable to attack or mechanical failure. The dependence on this fragile network was the Achilles heel of German surface raiding. Meanwhile, Allied convoys adapted further. Reports from survivors of Scheer's attacks, combined with intercepted communications, gave the Admiralty a clearer picture of her patterns. Convoys were rerouted around suspected hunting grounds, and warships were concentrated in areas where raiders might strike. The net may not have closed on Scheer directly, but her operational freedom diminished steadily. Each attack increased the risk of counter-detection, and each month at sea strained her machinery and crew. For the men aboard Admiral Scheer, the turning point was felt in daily life. The excitement of early victories gave way to the fatigue of extended deployment. Engines required constant maintenance, food supplies dwindled in variety, and the ship grew crowded with prisoners until they could be transferred. Officers remained vigilant, aware that one misjudgment could lead to destruction by a superior British task force. The knowledge that Graf Spee had been cornered and scuttled only 2 years earlier weighed heavily. Every decision, whether to attack a convoy, to rendezvous with a supply ship, or to break into a new operational area, carried existential stakes. The geopolitical context also influenced this shift. By June 1941, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. Naval resources were increasingly redirected towards supporting operations in the Arctic, including attacks on convoys supplying the Soviet Union through Murmansk and Archangel. The Atlantic remained vital, but strategic attention within the Kriegsmarine began to shift. Surface raiders like Admiral Scheer once seen as instruments of global disruption, now risked being sidelined in favor of operations more directly tied to Germany's Eastern campaign. For Britain and its allies, the persistence of Scheer remained a thorn in the side, but no longer a decisive danger. Losses inflicted by the raider, though painful, were increasingly outweighed by the growing success of convoy defenses and the mounting U-boat threat. Strategically, the Admiralty assessed that raiders could be contained with improved escort practices and global deployment, while submarines required far more complex solutions. This reassessment marked the beginning of the end for German reliance on surface raiding as a primary naval strategy. Thus, by late 1941, the course of Admiral Scheer's cruise reflected a broader turning point in the naval war. Surface raiders had proven they could disrupt and alarm, but they could not decisively sever Britain's lifelines. The Allies had adapted, developing new technologies, tactics, and strategies that reduced the raiders' effectiveness. For Germany, the resources devoted to such operations appeared increasingly questionable, especially as the submarine campaign promised greater returns. The voyage of Admiral Scheer did not end with destruction at sea, as had been the fate of Graf Spee. Instead, her survival into 1941 symbolized both the audacity and the limitations of Germany's surface fleet. The turning point lay not in her sinking, but in the realization, by both sides, that the era of commerce raiding by pocket battleships was closing. From this moment, Admiral Scheer's role shifted from active hunter to embattled survivor, a vessel still at sea but already overshadowed by the larger forces reshaping the war at sea. By the beginning of 1942, Admiral Scheer's long, commerce-raiding voyage was drawing to a close. The period that followed represented the aftermath of her operational peak, a gradual winding down of raiding activities, a cautious withdrawal back to Europe, and the broader reassessment of surface raider strategy within the Kriegsmarine. Unlike the dramatic destruction of Graf Spee or the eventual scuttling of Bismarck, Admiral Scheer's conclusion was defined by calculated survival. Yet this survival, while celebrated by Germany, also underscored the limitations of the entire enterprise. The final months of the voyage were shaped by diminishing opportunities. As Allied convoy defenses strengthened and German supply ships were hunted down, Kranke found it increasingly difficult to maintain momentum. By mid-1941, Scheer had already inflicted significant tonnage losses, but each subsequent sortie produced fewer results. Convoys were rerouted more effectively, merchant captains had become more alert, and distress signals often brought counterforces into the area too quickly for prolonged attacks. For the raider, the cost-benefit balance shifted. Every engagement carried mounting risks, while the potential rewards diminished. Logistics dictated the endgame. German supply ships in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans had been steadily reduced through Allied interceptions. Those that remained operated under constant threat, often forced to change rendezvous points at short notice. The destruction of tankers and auxiliaries meant that Admiral Scheer could no longer count on reliable fuel replenishment far from Europe. Each day at sea carried the danger of overextending beyond the possibility of safe return. Recognizing this, Kranke began steering his ship back toward the Atlantic approaches and, ultimately occupied France. The return voyage was itself perilous. Allied intelligence was now acutely aware of the raider threat, and patrols were intensified across possible routes back to Europe. The Bay of Biscay, gateway to French ports such as Brest and Lorient, was heavily monitored by the Royal Navy and the RAF Coastal Command. German Naval Command provided cover through U-boat screens and Luftwaffe reconnaissance, but the risk of interception by British battlecruisers or aircraft remained high. For the crew of Admiral Scheer, the withdrawal meant heightened vigilance. Every signal received, every aircraft sighted, could indicate the approach of overwhelming force. The ship's eventual safe arrival in a French port in early 1941-42 was hailed in Germany as a triumph. Propaganda emphasized her endurance, her survival against immense odds, and her destruction of over 1,000 tons of Allied shipping. Newspapers praised Kranke's leadership and the crew's discipline. Yet, within naval circles, the celebration was tempered by recognition of the larger strategic picture. Admiral Scheer had succeeded, but her success had not altered the course of the war at sea. Britain remained supplied, convoys continued to cross the oceans, and the Royal Navy's global presence had only grown stronger. For the Allies, the aftermath of Admiral Scheer's voyage was assessed in pragmatic terms. Losses to merchant shipping were regrettable, but the survival of most convoys demonstrated the resilience of the system. Lessons learned during her cruise accelerated further improvements. Convoys were more heavily armed, escort carriers were deployed more widely, and air patrols extended coverage across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. By the time Scheer returned to port, the window of opportunity for surface raiders had effectively closed. On the civilian side, the consequences of her voyage were deeply felt. Merchant sailors captured during Scheer's operations spent years as prisoners of war in Germany, their fates shaped by the chance encounters of the crews. Families in Britain, Greece, Norway, and other nations mourned the loss of seamen sunk in distant waters, often with little knowledge of where or how they had died. In Germany, the voyage was presented as a symbol of naval reach, but for the sailors themselves, the reality had been months of constant tension, monotony punctuated by sudden violence, and the psychological strain of operating in isolation. The aftermath also revealed the divergence between tactical achievement and strategic necessity. Admiral Scheer had forced the Royal Navy to deploy hunting groups, diverting ships and aircraft from other theaters. She had inflicted measurable losses on Allied trade. Yet, in the larger context, these achievements did not approach the level of disruption caused by U-boats. By the time of her return, Dönitz's submarine fleet was sinking hundreds of thousands of tons per month, reshaping the naval war in ways that surface raiders could not match. As a result, surface raiding as a strategy began to recede, eclipsed by the submarine campaign. The withdrawal of Admiral Scheer marked the end of an era. She had survived her cruise, unlike Graf Spee or Bismarck, but survival alone was insufficient to justify the continuation of such missions. Germany's focus shifted increasingly to submarine warfare, while surface ships like Scheer were retained for more limited roles, supporting Arctic operations, acting as fleet-in-being threats, or providing fire support closer to Europe. Her future service would reflect these new priorities, but the Nordseetour remained her defining moment. In retrospect, the aftermath of Operation Nordseetour demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of German naval planning. A single-pocket battleship had compelled Britain to commit vast resources to defense, proving that raiding could achieve disproportionate psychological and operational impact. Yet the inability to translate these disruptions into decisive strategic outcomes highlighted the constraints under which the Kriegsmarine operated. The voyage of Admiral Scheer ended not with catastrophe, but with a sober acknowledgement of limits, a recognition that Germany's surface fleet could harass, but not decide, the struggle for control of the seas. The legacy of Admiral Scheer's long cruise, codenamed Operation Nordseetour, extended well beyond the immediate tonnage of shipping destroyed. Historically, it became a focal point in debates about the role of Germany's surface fleet during the Second World War and the effectiveness of commerce raiding as a naval strategy. The operation demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of using heavy warships to attack Allied trade. For historians, the story of Scheer oscillates between two interpretations: a daring demonstration of endurance and reach, or a costly experiment that underscored the futility of challenging Britain's maritime dominance with limited resources. From the German perspective, the cruise was celebrated as a rare success for the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet. Unlike Admiral Graf Spee, which was cornered and scuttled in 1939, or Bismarck, sunk in May 1941 after only days at sea, Admiral Scheer returned intact after months of global operations. Propaganda emphasized her survival and the destruction of over 1,000 tons of shipping, presenting the ship as proof that Germany could project power across distant oceans. For the crew, survival itself became a source of pride, a marker that discipline and tactical caution had prevailed against enormous odds. Yet within the naval staff, the results were viewed more critically. The tonnage sunk was impressive for a single vessel, but modest when compared to the submarine fleet, which by 1941 was sinking several 100,000 tons monthly. For Britain and its allies, the legacy of Admiral Scheer was measured not in losses but in adaptation. Her voyage accelerated changes in convoy escort doctrine, leading to the rapid expansion of escort carriers, the wider use of long-range patrol aircraft, and the establishment of permanent convoy routes in previously less guarded regions such as the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean. Merchant captains became more vigilant, training in evasive maneuvers and wireless reporting procedures. Allied intelligence networks improved, drawing on survivor reports, signals interception, and aerial reconnaissance to track raider movements more effectively. By the end of 1941, the operational freedom that Admiral Scheer had initially enjoyed had been substantially reduced. Politically, the raid influenced neutral nations as well. In South America, sightings of German raiders and supply ships raised concerns about violations of neutrality and the risks posed to local shipping. The United States, still neutral in 1941, monitored such incidents closely, using them to justify the expansion of its own Atlantic patrols. While Germany sought to avoid direct confrontation with American vessels, the very presence of raiders highlighted the global scope of the war and contributed to the erosion of strict neutrality in the Western Hemisphere. In naval historiography, Operation Nordseetour stands as the most successful surface raider voyage of the Second World War. Yet it is also seen as the last of its kind. The increasing reach of Allied air power, the development of escort carriers, and the effectiveness of the convoy system closed the operational space for such missions. Later, German attempts to send surface ships into the Atlantic or Arctic met with far greater risks and often disastrous outcomes. Tirpitz, Gneisenau, and Scharnhorst spent most of their service confined to northern waters, their potential limited by the constant threat of overwhelming Allied response. For Admiral Scheer herself, the Nordseetour became her defining achievement. After her return, she was redeployed for more limited missions, supporting operations in the Arctic, bombarding Soviet positions, and serving as a fleet in being in northern waters. Though she remained an active warship until 1945, her role was increasingly constrained. In April 1945, she was sunk in Kiel Harbor during an Allied bombing raid, capsizing in shallow water. Her wreck was later broken up after the war, leaving little physical trace of a ship that had once circled the globe as a feared commerce raider. The human legacy was equally complex. Hundreds of merchant sailors taken prisoner during Scheer's voyage spent years in German captivity, their lives altered by a chance encounter on the open ocean. For the German crew, the long voyage remained a formative memory, months of isolation, endurance, and combat, framed by the knowledge that one mistake could have brought destruction. For Allied sailors, the memory was often one of sudden loss, a freighter shelled without warning, comrades drowned or captured, and the uncertainty of whether the convoy system could truly keep them safe. In the broader scope of the war, Admiral Scheer's cruise is remembered as both audacious and ultimately limited. It highlighted Germany's capacity for daring operations, but also revealed the structural disadvantages faced by a naval power without global bases or numerical superiority. The lesson for later generations was clear. Isolated warships could disrupt, but not decide the outcome of maritime warfare against a superior enemy. Today, the voyage of Admiral Scheer occupies a place in naval history as a study in contrasts. It was the most far-reaching and successful surface raider operation of the conflict, yet it confirmed the declining relevance of such strategies in the face of modern air-sea coordination. It demonstrated the professionalism and resilience of a crew operating at the edge of endurance, but also the limitations of commerce raiding as a tool of grand strategy. In the end, Operation Nordseetour was both a triumph of execution and an acknowledgement of strategic futility, a story that illuminates the complexity of naval warfare in the Second World War and the interplay of daring, adaptation, and inevitability in the struggle for control of the seas.